I can't marry someone like you, Joseph. You're too poor, Tina sneered, signing the divorce papers as if she had crushed his life. She had no idea that the man she humiliated had spent every sleepless night secretly building the life she mocked. When he walked into her wedding, calm, confident, and unrecognizable, the shock in that room changed everything, and her smug little world would never recover. Viewers, have you ever been betrayed so deeply it cut like a knife? Could you come back stronger than anyone imagined? Comment below. Subscribe, like, comment and watch till the ending. Tio, share this interesting story to your family and friends. My name is Joseph Rice. I'm 34, a software engineer, and I live in Manchester, England. On the surface, my life looked ordinary, my job, my apartment, my marriage, but behind the facade there were dreams, ambitions, and a heart that believed in love too much. I thought Tina, my wife of 3 years, loved me the way I loved her. I thought we were partners. I was wrong. The night she handed me the divorce papers is etched in my memory like a film I cannot stop replaying. It started as a quiet evening. Rain tapped gently against the windows of our flat, filling the room with a soft, rhythmic sound that usually calmed me. But that night, it did nothing to calm the storm brewing inside me. Tina walked in, her heels clicking against the wooden floor, holding a file with such nonchalance it made my chest tighten. Her hair, always perfect, framed her face like a halo, but her eyes held something cold, calculating. She slid the file across the coffee table toward me. I can't spend my life being poor, Joseph, she said. Her voice was calm, almost sweet, but the words were daggers. My hands froze mid-motion, reaching for the cup of tea I hadn't even finished. I stared at her expecting, what? An explanation? Tears? An apology? Nothing. Only that cruel, simple sentence that shattered everything. I remembered the nights I had stayed late at the office, quietly building my savings, secretly investing in a small tech startup that no one, not even Tina, knew about. I remembered the weekends I spent researching, coding, planning our future while she shopped online, comparing handbags, fancy dinners, and social media likes. I had thought she admired my drive, my patience, my focus. I had been wrong. She had grown up surrounded by money and privilege, taught that wealth was the measure of worth. And in her mind, I was failing. The flat felt smaller that night, the shadows longer, the rain heavier. I tried to speak, to reason, to remind her of the vows we had made, of the nights we stayed up laughing until our sides hurt, the dreams we had whispered to each other in the dark. But the words lodged in my throat, meaningless against the steel of her resolve. She didn't want my words, she wanted escape. I left that night without a word, dragging my suitcase through the rain-soaked streets of Manchester, feeling the sting of betrayal with every step. Friends tried to call, to comfort me, but I couldn't answer. I couldn't explain that the woman I loved had decided to erase everything we shared because, in her eyes, I wasn't rich enough. And yet, even as I sat alone in my tiny rented apartment, surrounded by cardboard boxes and memories, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her decision than she was telling me. Something under the surface, a hidden motive, a secret I didn't yet understand. The envelope that arrived weeks later would confirm my suspicions, but I didn't know that yet. It sat on the counter, her handwriting neat and deliberate. Inside there was no letter, no explanation, only a wedding invitation. I stared at it, my pulse quickening. The invitation bore her name, and the words were polite, almost conciliatory. Joseph, it would mean a lot if you could come. Why would she want me there? What game was she playing? And most importantly, who was she marrying? I didn't know then that this moment, the invitation, would mark the beginning of the most shocking, humiliating, and yet empowering night of my life. I didn't know that every choice I had made in silence, every sleepless night, every hidden effort, was about to collide with her carefully constructed life in a way she would never forget. I closed my eyes and imagined walking into that church, imagining her face when she saw me. The thought made my stomach twist with a combination of fear, anger, and something darker, something I had never felt before, anticipation. I moved out that night, the rain soaking through my coat, cold seeping into my bones as though it wanted to punish me for trusting too easily. My flat in Manchester was small, barely more than a studio, but it was mine, at least in the sense that I could finally cry without her watching, without the judgment in her eyes. I unpacked only the essentials: my laptop, a few clothes, and the photo frames I couldn't bear to part with. Every picture was a dagger. A frozen memory of laughter, whispered dreams, kisses in the dark. She had erased them all from her mind, but I couldn't. I spent days alone, wandering the streets, sitting in cafes pretending to read while my thoughts tore me apart. I replayed every moment with her, trying to understand when the love I believed in had turned into this merciless judgment. I remembered our first apartment, how she had walked through it with sparkling eyes, talking about the perfect future we would build. I had been so happy, so blind. The nights were the worst. I'd lie on the cheap mattress, staring at the ceiling, and the memories would press down on me. I remembered the time she had cried over a designer bag she couldn't afford and how I had stayed awake all night comforting her, telling her the world didn't revolve around money. How foolish that seemed now. I had been too patient, too understanding, too weak to see her for who she truly was. And yet, amidst the heartbreak there was anger. Quiet, simmering anger that grew stronger every day. How dare she judge me for what I had not yet achieved? How dare she reduce years of loyalty and love to a single adjective, poor? I began to notice the whispers from neighbors when I returned from work. Friends avoided me. I felt like a ghost in my own life, like the world had agreed with her decision and left me to rot in shame. It was during one of those long, miserable afternoons that an envelope arrived. No stamp, just her handwriting. My hands trembled as I tore it open, fearing what cruel joke might lie inside. There was no letter. No apology. No explanation. Just a wedding invitation. I stared at it for what felt like hours. Her name printed elegantly at the top. Polite, neat, deliberate. Joseph, it would mean a lot if you could come. I didn't know whether to laugh or scream. I felt like I was caught in one of those terrible dreams that blur reality and nightmare. Who was she marrying? Was this an act of cruelty? Was she daring me to show up, to prove that I had failed? The anticipation twisted my stomach, but beneath the fear, beneath the confusion, a seed of something else began to grow, something I hadn't felt in months. It was ambition. Silent, burning ambition that reminded me of the nights I had spent working while she flaunted her shallow pleasures. The nights I had invested in a startup she would have scoffed at had I ever mentioned it. The nights I had believed in a future she thought I didn't deserve. That seed of ambition became a plan. I wouldn't just go to the wedding. I would arrive transformed. She would see the man she thought she had destroyed, and realize she had underestimated me. That thought kept me awake all night. Images of the wedding flashed through my mind. The guests, the flowers, the smug smile on her face when I walked in. I imagined her shock. I imagined the subtle but undeniable power shift. And I knew with absolute certainty that this wasn't about revenge in the conventional sense. This was about something more profound: justice. Self-respect. Rising above someone who had never valued me. I didn't yet know how it would unfold. I didn't know what I would see, what I would uncover, what secrets would spill that night. But I knew one thing: I would not be humiliated again. Not by her. Not by anyone. Subscribe for more stories. Weeks passed in a blur of quiet planning and restless nights. Every day I imagined walking into that church, seeing Tina in white, the smug satisfaction in her smile, the way she always believed she could control everything. I replayed the memory of our arguments over money, over ambitions she never respected, and over her constant need for status. I remembered the night we first met at a mutual friend's dinner in Manchester, how she had laughed at my modest apartment, how I had been too enamored to notice the small judgments, the sharpness in her eyes disguised as charm. Back then I had thought she was different, that beneath the layers of social pretense there was warmth, humor, and love. But now, as I held her wedding invitation in my hands, I realized how blind I had been. She wasn't cruel for the sake of cruelty. She had been trained by a life surrounded by wealth to measure people by what they had, not who they were. Every gift she had ever wanted, every designer handbag, every fancy dinner, had been a reflection of the upbringing she carried in her bones. She had never been able to love me fully because she couldn't see beyond my lack of financial clout. And yet, I had worked silently, tirelessly, building something she could never have imagined. My startup, the one I had kept secret from her, was finally taking off. Investors had come forward, contracts were signed, and my bank account, once modest, had grown into something she would never have expected. All those late nights, all those weekends I spent coding while she scrolled social media, had a purpose. And now, purpose turned into opportunity. I began planning my entrance. I didn't want her to see me as I had been, weak, insecure, disregarded. I wanted her to see the man she had underestimated. I imagined the tailored suit, the subtle shine of a luxury watch on my wrist, the polished shoes, the car that would turn heads as I pulled up to the church. I imagined her heart skipping a beat, her carefully composed smile faltering, if only for a moment. But I also wondered, was it only her wealth-driven ego that had driven her to leave me? Or was there something else, something deeper, hidden beneath the surface? I thought of her late nights at her parents' house, the calls I had never been invited to listen to, the occasional glances at her phone she quickly hid. Secrets. Always secrets. Perhaps that's why she wanted me there, because she knew, on some level, that I had begun to see through her. And then came the day I made the decision. I would go. I would arrive. But I would not rush in blindly. I would observe, gather information, feel the tension in the room, and most importantly, let her pride begin to crumble on its own. I imagined the whispers among the guests, the subtle glances, the unease as they saw me standing there. I imagined the small victories that would begin to stack, one by one, until she realized that the man she had discarded was no longer beneath her. I smiled to myself, a small, quiet smile as I tucked the wedding invitation into my jacket pocket. This was no longer about heartbreak. It was about strategy, about timing, about claiming a dignity she had thought she could strip away. And deep down, I knew that whatever awaited me at that church, nothing would be the same again. The morning I decided to attend the wedding, Manchester's streets were drenched in a pale, silver light. The sky threatened rain, but it hadn't yet fallen, as if the city itself was holding its breath. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, adjusting the cuffs of my suit, feeling the weight of anticipation settle in my chest. This wasn't just about walking into a wedding, it was about entering a stage where every glance, every whisper, and every subtle movement would count. I remembered the first time Tina had met my parents. She had praised the house, the modest garden, the tea we drank, but her eyes betrayed her judgment. My father, a hard-working man with calloused hands and quiet wisdom, had smiled warmly, oblivious to her subtle disdain. My mother, ever gentle, had offered her tea and biscuits, but Tina had glanced around as if looking for faults, as if everything had to meet some invisible standard of wealth. At the time, I had excused it, thinking it was nervousness. Now, I realized it had been the first warning I had ignored. She measured love in currency, not character. I sat on the edge of the bed and ran my fingers over a sleek watch I had bought just last week. Nothing ostentatious, but enough to suggest someone who had arrived without needing to flaunt it. I checked my reflection again, imagining her eyes as I walked into the church. Wide, startled, that flicker of panic hidden behind the carefully constructed mask she always wore. I remembered the nights I spent coding in the quiet of the apartment, the endless lines of code that no one had applauded, the nights I had stayed awake imagining the day I could prove myself, not for anyone else but for me. The car I drove that morning, a black sedan polished to a mirror shine, felt like an extension of my resolve. Every turn of the wheel, every shift of the gears, reminded me of the patience and planning it had taken to reach this point. I thought about Tina, imagining the smug satisfaction on her face when she saw me. She expected a broken, defeated man. She expected humiliation, quiet tears, embarrassment. But she would see none of that. And yet, a part of me hesitated. Was this about revenge, or was it about proving something to myself? I remembered the nights I had doubted myself, the evenings I had questioned whether love was worth the sacrifices I had made, the mornings I had woken to find her leaving for parties or social events while I labored on my dreams. Perhaps she had always been a test I hadn't realized I was passing, and now the results would be undeniable. I glanced at the wedding invitation again. The words, polite and deliberate, burned into my mind. Joseph, it would mean a lot if you could come. I wondered if she knew how much I had changed, how far I had come. Perhaps she imagined I would remain timid, meek, and unnoticed. That assumption, that underestimation, would be the sharpest weapon in my arsenal. I started the car, the engine humming softly as I drove through the streets, feeling the tension rise like electricity in the air. Each turn brought me closer to the church, closer to the confrontation I had rehearsed 1,000 times in my mind. I didn't yet know what I would see inside, the faces, the whispers, the hidden truths, but I knew one thing: I would enter as a man reborn. Not for her, not for the guests, but for myself. And when that moment came, everything would change. The church doors loomed ahead, tall and imposing, the stained glass windows catching the morning sun and throwing fractured patterns of color onto the wet cobblestones. I parked the car a few streets away, not wanting to announce my arrival prematurely. Every step toward the entrance felt heavier, charged with anticipation. I could see the crowd gathering through the glass. Friends, family, colleagues, all smiling, chatting, oblivious to the storm I was about to bring into their perfect little world. I paused for a moment on the stone steps, inhaling deeply. My mind flashed back to our first date at that riverside cafe in Manchester. She had been radiant, laughing at my jokes, her eyes sparkling like she had discovered some secret world only I could see. I had been so utterly captivated, so completely convinced that she loved me. And now, I realized how carefully she had curated that illusion, how the charm had masked ambition, vanity, and entitlement. As I entered, the soft hum of the organ filled the space. My heart raced, not from fear but from anticipation. And then I saw her. Tina. She was radiant as always, but something was different. Her smile, perfectly poised for the cameras and the guests, faltered for just a fraction of a second when our eyes met. A flicker of recognition, of panic, a crack in the armor she had always worn. But my attention was drawn to the groom. And my breath caught. It wasn't her fiancé, the wealthy businessman she had bragged about to anyone who would listen. It was him, her ex-boyfriend, the one she had supposedly moved on from, the one she had told everyone she left me for. A knot twisted in my stomach. Something in that instant told me there were secrets even the wedding guests didn't know. I moved forward slowly, my polished shoes quiet on the marble floor, feeling the weight of every gaze on me. Whispers began almost immediately, subtle glances darting my way. Some faces registered shock, others curiosity. And all the while, Tina froze mid-step, her bouquet clutched tighter in her hands. For a moment I imagined her thoughts racing. How did he, why is he here, what does he know? I remembered the nights she had spent at her parents' house, secretive phone calls, hurried messages I was never allowed to see. The glances at her screen she would hide too quickly. I had thought they were insignificant, but now I wondered if they had been part of a carefully orchestrated life I had been kept outside of. A life built on appearances, lies, and a relentless desire for status. Every muscle in my body tensed as I continued forward. I felt the power shift subtly in the room, though no one yet realized it. The ex-boyfriend's jaw tightened slightly as our eyes met. He sensed, perhaps, that the man he assumed she had discarded had transformed into someone else entirely. Someone confident, composed, and quietly dangerous in the sense that comes from knowing your own worth. The organist's notes swelled as I approached the aisle. My pulse quickened, but my face remained calm. I smiled faintly to myself, savoring the weight of anticipation, the tiny crack forming in Tina's perfectly polished facade. She had invited me here, perhaps thinking she could control the narrative, humiliate me one last time. She didn't know that the man she underestimated was about to rewrite the story entirely. Her smile faltered the moment our eyes locked. I could see it, the fleeting panic, the split-second doubt she tried desperately to mask. Tina had always been meticulous, careful to control every gaze, every impression, every whispered judgment in a room. And yet, here she was in front of everyone, frozen for just a heartbeat. That tiny hesitation told me everything I needed to know. She realized, even if only subconsciously, that the man she thought she had discarded was no longer beneath her. I continued down the aisle slowly, deliberately, letting every footfall echo softly through the church. The murmurs around me grew louder, though nobody dared speak too clearly. Friends, family, colleagues, they were all registering something, the subtle shift in power, the silent weight I carried into the room. The ex-boyfriend, standing rigidly beside her, straightened, suspicion flickering across his face. He had not expected me, and his confidence faltered, just enough for me to notice. As I approached, my mind replayed years of memories, sharp and painful like shards of glass. I remembered the nights she had cried about material things I couldn't afford. I remembered the vacations we had canceled because I wanted to save for a future she hadn't understood. I remembered her laughter, once so warm and bright, turning suddenly cold, cutting, dismissive, whenever I dared to voice my own needs, my own dreams. Those memories had fueled me in silence, shaping the man I had become. I reached the front of the aisle and paused a few meters away from her. The organist's notes swelled, the sunlight catching the edges of the stained glass, casting fractured patterns of color across the floor. Tina's hand tightened around the bouquet. She glanced at the ex, then at me, then at the guests, and I could almost hear the frantic calculations in her mind. Her carefully constructed world was showing cracks. I could see the subtle tremble in her fingers, the slight falter in her posture, the tension in the line of her jaw. Every detail, no matter how small, screamed that she had underestimated me. She had assumed I would remain small, meek, unnoticed. But here I was, calm, composed, radiating the quiet confidence that comes from knowing your own worth. I leaned in slightly, lowering my voice so only she could hear. Did you really think I'd stay poor forever? My words were measured, almost casual, but they carried a weight she couldn't deny. The ex-boyfriend stiffened beside her, eyes narrowing, sensing the subtle power shift but not yet understanding its full scope. I didn't need to yell. I didn't need to make a scene. The room itself felt charged with tension, as if the air recognized the reversal of fortune unfolding in silence. Every whisper, every glance, every polite murmur among the guests became a drumbeat echoing my arrival and her faltering facade. For the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before the betrayal. Calm satisfaction, the quiet strength of knowing that my silent efforts, my patience, and my ambition had prepared me for this very moment. I had arrived not just at a wedding, but at a point where every subtle gesture, every glance, every carefully measured step carried the power of vindication. Tina's breath hitched slightly, her eyes widening for a fraction of a second longer than decorum allowed. I knew then that I had her attention, and more importantly, that she knew I had the power to change everything in that room without uttering a single shout. The game had begun and I had arrived as the master player. Please subscribe for more stories. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The silence around us was louder than any shout could ever be. Tina's carefully maintained composure wavered, the ex-boyfriend's posture stiffened, and the guests shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension but not yet understanding its source. I let the moment stretch, letting the subtle power of my presence settle like a shadow over the room. This was my quiet revenge, one built on patience, precision, and silent triumph. I moved closer, enough for Tina to see the confidence in my expression, but without aggression. I offered a polite nod to her ex, a gesture that communicated nothing on the surface but spoke volumes beneath it. Every guest caught the nuance, every whisper a reflection of the subtle upheaval I had initiated without a single word spoken loudly. This was the thing she had never accounted for, my quiet authority, the calm strength forged in months of isolation, reflection, and ambition. I thought of the nights she had spent critiquing me, questioning my potential, and dismissing my efforts. I remembered the sleepless evenings coding in our tiny flat, the countless hours I had invested in a startup she would have laughed at. Those nights had been my crucible, and now, standing here, polished and confident, I could feel the transformation manifest in every subtle glance, every measured breath. Her bouquet trembled in her hands. I saw the tight clench of her jaw and the fleeting flicker of panic in her eyes. She had always depended on appearances, on the illusion that she could control reality through wealth, charm, and careful calculation. But that illusion was cracking. Each heartbeat in the room echoed that truth. The man she had discarded was no longer the one she thought she knew. I let my eyes wander over the guests, gauging reactions, noting every raised brow, every hushed murmur. I could see them piecing together what I already knew. Her perfectly curated world was vulnerable. She had underestimated the consequences of leaving me, of assuming that leaving a man behind meant leaving him powerless. And then came the briefest of moments, a whisper from the wedding planner as she passed by. "You should know, she's been lying about him for months," she said softly, just enough for me to catch the words. My pulse quickened, a quiet smile forming as the pieces fell into place. She had been constructing a narrative for everyone in that room, including the ex-boyfriend. She had lied, manipulated, and hidden truths to maintain the illusion of control. But now, those lies would unravel silently, elegantly, without a single scene of public shame. I took another step closer to Tina, keeping my voice low, intimate, and deliberate. "Do you really think I can't see through you?" I whispered, letting the weight of my presence hang in the air like a tangible force. Her hands tightened around the bouquet again, her smile now brittle, her carefully rehearsed gestures faltering. The ex-boyfriend's suspicion grew. Guests leaned in subtly, noticing the crack in the facade, sensing a quiet war waging between the two of us that no one else fully understood yet. I had arrived not just as a man wronged, but as a force reshaping the narrative she had carefully built. In that moment I realized that revenge didn't need to be loud. It could be subtle, precise, psychological. And in that church, bathed in filtered sunlight and tension, I had already begun. The whisper from the wedding planner lingered in my mind as I stood there, inches from Tina, every guest oblivious to the undercurrent of secrets flowing just beneath the surface. "She's been lying about him for months." The words replayed like a drumbeat in my mind, each repetition sharpening the clarity of what I had long suspected. Tina's life wasn't just built on wealth and status, it was a web of manipulations, a careful orchestration to hide her failures, her mistakes, her vulnerability. I allowed myself a small, private smile, one that no one could see, knowing that the truth would emerge naturally, elegantly. I didn't need to yell. I didn't need to expose her publicly. I had already arrived as proof of what she had overlooked, what she had underestimated. The weight of my presence alone was enough to begin dismantling the empire of illusions she had so meticulously built. My mind flashed back to the small details I had ignored during our marriage, the moments that seemed insignificant at the time but now carried the weight of revelation. The late-night calls she pretended were for work. The sudden trips she never explained. The hurried glances at her phone, the way she would smile a certain way when certain people texted or called. Those were the pieces of the puzzle I had finally begun to assemble, and now I held them together in perfect clarity. I leaned slightly closer, keeping my voice low and intimate so only she could hear. "Do you think I haven't noticed everything?" Her hand tightened on the bouquet again, knuckles whitening. She met my gaze, her lips pressed together, a flash of panic betraying her carefully rehearsed composure. For a fleeting second, I saw a crack in her carefully polished facade. The ex-boyfriend shifted beside her, sensing that something was amiss but not fully understanding what. His eyes flickered to mine, then back to Tina, confusion and suspicion etching his face. The guests meanwhile remained largely oblivious, caught between polite observation and subtle curiosity. But even they couldn't escape the subtle tension radiating from me, the quiet storm building with each controlled movement, each measured glance. I recalled all the nights I had spent in silence, investing in my future while she flaunted her desires and dismissed my efforts. The startup that had seemed like a gamble, the hours coding alone in the dim light of our old flat, all of it had led to this moment. I had built something tangible, something undeniable, something she could never have imagined. And now, her carefully scripted narrative would start to unravel without a single dramatic outburst, simply through the force of reality, through the undeniable fact of my success. I straightened, allowing the silence to stretch, feeling it wrap around her like a vice. I could see her calculating, thinking, realizing that her lies, her stories, her manipulations were fragile, brittle under scrutiny. And all I had done was exist in the room. In that moment I understood something essential. Power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, seeps in quietly, and unravels everything that once seemed untouchable. And as I watched Tina's facade begin to tremble, I knew the next steps would be decisive, subtle, and utterly irreversible. The room went still. I didn't have to do anything, not really. My presence, my calm, my silent certainty, had already begun to speak louder than any words ever could. Tina's face, once a mask of perfect composure, was now pale, her lips pressed so tightly I thought they might crack. The bouquet in her hands sagged slightly as the tension in the air grew thicker, denser, wrapping everyone in an invisible weight. I could feel it radiating, felt it like a current running through the church, touching the ex-boyfriend, the guests, everyone present. I let my eyes sweep slowly across the room, taking in the subtle reactions. Some guests exchanged uncertain glances, whispers curling in the corners of their mouths. Some smiled politely though uneasily. But I noticed those small shifts, the subtle stiffening of posture, the fleeting looks of suspicion, the half-smiles that tried to mask recognition of something they couldn't yet name. And then I saw her, Tina, her eyes darting back and forth between me and the ex, realizing that the narrative she had so carefully built was beginning to collapse, piece by piece. I remembered the nights she had claimed independence, the stories she told everyone about leaving me for someone richer, smarter, better. Was every word a fabrication. I had spent months, weeks even, piecing together the truth, learning to move in silence, waiting for the moment when all of her constructions would meet reality. That moment was here. I leaned slightly toward her and let the faintest, quietest smile touch my lips. "You really thought I'd stay invisible, didn't you?" My voice was soft, almost conversational, but it carried the weight of all the truth she had tried to hide. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to accuse. The room was already listening even if no one yet understood why. The ex-boyfriend's expression shifted, confusion giving way to unease. He had assumed the man she had discarded was powerless, diminished, irrelevant. But he saw me now, calm, poised, undeniably in control. A subtle tension passed between us, unspoken, a silent understanding of what she had overlooked. Tina's carefully curated world was crumbling, and she had no one to blame but herself. I let my gaze linger on her face, watching her panic grow in microseconds. Every carefully rehearsed gesture she had perfected over years of social observation faltered. The ex-boyfriend stiffened beside her, unsure how to respond, unsure how to navigate the invisible game unfolding before him. The guests began to notice, their polite attention shifting toward a realization they didn't yet have words for. The man they thought defeated was standing stronger than ever. I had arrived not just to witness her downfall, but to let it unfold naturally. She had underestimated patience, underestimated silent strength, underestimated me. Every flash of realization, every faltering smile, every whisper of uncertainty among the guests was a testament to the months I had spent building, planning, and growing in ways she could never predict. For the first time in years, I felt the satisfaction of quiet victory, the slow, deliberate rise of power that needed no dramatics to assert itself. The room, the people, the tension, everything conspired to make this moment a revelation. And as I held her gaze, letting her see the full measure of what she had lost and what I had become, I realized the final act was at hand, and nothing would ever be the same. I didn't shout. I didn't stage a dramatic confrontation. I didn't need to. The silence I maintained carried more weight than any outburst ever could. The room, once filled with polite chatter and muted excitement, now hung heavy with tension, every whisper and glance subtly acknowledging the shift I had initiated. Tina's face was pale, her perfectly composed facade shattered into fragments she could no longer mend. She had assumed I would be broken, defeated, irrelevant, but I had arrived as someone she could no longer control. I straightened, allowing a quiet calm to radiate from me. Every detail mattered: the measured tilt of my head, the slow, deliberate steps I took, the slight, controlled smile that let her know I had seen through every lie, every manipulation, every pretense she had ever attempted. The ex-boyfriend beside her stiffened visibly, now understanding that the narrative he had accepted was crumbling. The guests, polite but observant, began to whisper, some glancing at one another, sensing but not fully understanding the power shift taking place before their eyes. I remembered the months I had spent alone, the nights coding while she indulged herself, the days of quiet reflection, the small victories I had achieved in silence, the plans that had slowly come to fruition without her knowledge. All of it had led to this moment, the realization that the man she had discarded was now untouchable by her judgment, her cruelty, or her social manipulation. Every secret she had tried to bury, every lie she had spun about me, was now exposed, not by scandal, not by anger, but by the undeniable fact of my success, my growth, my presence. I leaned slightly toward her, my voice quiet, intimate, carrying only enough for her to hear. "You thought you could erase me," I said softly, "but some things can't be taken away. Not by anyone." She swallowed, her breath catching, her perfectly polished mask trembling. I could see her realizing fully that I had become someone she could never underestimate again. I didn't wait for her to respond. I stepped back, nodded politely to the ex-boyfriend, and allowed my gaze to sweep across the guests. Each whisper, each glance, each small murmur reinforced the truth. Tina's carefully constructed world had shifted, subtly but irrevocably, and the man she had dismissed was standing taller than ever. Outside the church, Manchester glimmered beneath the late afternoon sun, the cityscape reflecting the sense of closure I felt within. I walked to my car slowly, savoring the quiet satisfaction of justice that required no spectacle. I had arrived, I had observed, and I had claimed my dignity without degrading anyone but the illusion they had all accepted. And yet, as I drove through the streets, a faint tension lingered in my chest. There were threads left untied, whispers of secrets yet untold, possibilities of stories that could resurface in the future. Tina had underestimated me once, but she was only one of many in a world filled with illusions, ambitions, and people who believed they could control outcomes. I smiled faintly, feeling the quiet strength of a man who had endured, who had grown, and who had risen above betrayal. Some lessons are learned through pain. Some victories are silent. And some stories, no matter how much they conclude, leave threads for the next chapter. Manchester stretched out before me, streets glinting in the fading light, and I realized something fundamental. Revenge is not always about hurting someone. Sometimes it's about rising above them, reclaiming your dignity, and discovering that the power you sought was inside you all along. And as the sun dipped below the skyline, I knew this wasn't the end. It was simply the beginning of a new chapter, one I would write on my own terms. Subscribe, like, comment, and share for more interesting stories.